welcome to another How to Code Well video tutorial. My name's Peter Fisher, and today we're going to do a question and answers video based on one of my old MySQL Console videos. That was a demonstration of how to create a table in the MySQL Console. The video was done many moons ago, and I'll put a link to it in this description for anyone to take a look. Now, the question was sent in by Benham Anisi, and I do apologize, Benham, if I've mispronounced your name. So the question is, what does it mean by the default null when you're creating MySQL table? So what does the default null statement do when creating the table? And also, what does the primary key do? What does that mean? So there's two questions here. I'm going to focus on the primary key first, and then I'm going to look at the default null afterwards. Okay, so we're in the MySQL console now, and if I was to just quickly do a describe of the customer table. So this is the structure, this is the schema of the customer table here. We can see that we've got a field column on the left, and these are the fields or the columns which are within the table, and then we've got subsequent columns that represent different settings and values that make up the structure for each of these fields. Now let's focus on the first one, the ID. The ID has a key of primary, PRI, and we can see that's the only key in this table. It has a type of 11. It cannot be null, so null is set to no. That basically means here that you cannot, it cannot be blank. Okay, it must always be present for every record. So there must always be a value. There must always be an ID value for each record in this table. It's the primary key, and I'll get onto that in a minute. Its default is null, which means that the default value of the primary key cannot be blank. Oh, sorry, is blank. And it's got an extra setting of auto_increment. Now what this does, and I've mentioned this before in a previous video, which I'll link in the description below, but what this does is it means that for every record that you insert into the table, it will increment the value based on the previous inserted ID. So for example, if you've got a table of 5 records and you insert a new record and you do not supply the ID, then the ID will be incremented to be 6 because that's the next one. And then the next one after that will be 7 and 8 and so forth. So what does the primary key actually do? What does that mean? Well, the primary key is used as a unique identifier for that record, and it's helpful when running delete and update queries, where you can reduce the query to just the records that you want to deal with. So let's say you had a table that had 1,000 records, and you needed to delete the 500th record, but only that record. You didn't want to delete anything else, you just wanted to delete that one record. Well, you would do a where clause, and I've done this in the video before, which I'll link to. You put in a where clause where the ID is equal to 500, and because it's a primary key, because it's unique, because it's auto incrementing, which means that for every record it's going to be different, you are guaranteeing yourself that you are going to only delete that one record. You're not going to delete any other record because no other record will have an ID with the same value. Okay, so that's what primary key means. It is the unique value, the unique identifier for that one record. And I say auto increment means that it's going to increment the value each time the record is inserted. Each time a record is inserted into the table. And as I've mentioned, I've talked about this before, and I'll put in a link in the description below. So the next one is about the default null, and what does that mean? Well, okay, so we've got the default column here, and we've got different values. So we've got null in some of these, so from the ID to the email, that's null. But we have different values for, say, the isActive and the gender and the title, even the created and the update dates. And if it was an updated or a created date, then we default it to the current timestamp. So what a default does is it defaults the value of the record that you're inserting to the MySQL table. It changes its value to be the default if no value is supplied. So if you go and insert a record into the table without a created date, then its value will always be the current timestamp. And in the same light, if you insert a customer record into this customer table without supplying the gender, then the gender will always default to male. And if you insert one without the is_active field, then its value will always be set to 0. So what does it mean when you insert when the default value is set to null? Well, null means that it's blank, which means that there isn't a default value given. And so if you insert a record and it doesn't have the first, and you don't supply the first name, well, no default value will be used. And if the default is null and it's used in conjunction with this null column here, so if the default is null and the null value is no, we're basically saying that the first name must be supplied because it can't be null. And the default is null. Well, that can't happen, which is why you get an error. So, and I'll just prove that. So let's run an insert. So we're inserting into the customer table. We're only supplying the first name, and we're saying the value of the first name is going to be set to foo. So we're not supplying the last name or the email or the isActive. We're not even supplying the ID. And as I mentioned before, we don't need to supply the ID because we're always going to auto increment. But this won't work. And it won't work because the last name has the null setting of no, which means that it cannot be null. But the default is null, which means that that's going to throw an error. Okay, so let's just run that and see what happens. So we can see that the field last name doesn't have a default value, and that's because the default value is null and it cannot be null. Okay, so I hope that has explained what a primary key and what the null means. As I've mentioned before, I have touched on these in a bit more detail in other videos, which I will link in the description below. But if you've got any more questions, then please do let me know. And happy coding. Thank you for watching. Please click the like button if you found it useful, and make sure to subscribe to get the next tutorial. If you have any comments, questions or queries, then please leave them in the comments section below. Alternatively, you can tweet them to my Twitter handle, which is PFWD. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon.